what are the types of books that cause professional graders fits?
Yeah, there's, the first thing that comes to mind are.
For this video, I am delighted to have Matt Nelson. Not only is he president of CGC, but he's a comic book historian, expert grader, and an expert at restoration. By the way, I invited Matt back in mid-December to have this conversation. So this is mostly about his collecting, his experiences, his expertise. But in between that time, we have the reholder issue that's going on. So Matt, the first question that I wanted to ask you is, do you have any update on the reholder scam?
Not really much of an update from the last interview I did. Basically, kind of the same thing, which is ongoing investigation. We published the list of books on our website in question. So, I'm just encouraging anybody that happens to have a book on that list to please reach out to us, and we'll take care of that for you. But yeah, it's an ongoing investigation, and obviously, I can't share much still. But as we go forth with this, any new information that comes forward that we can share, we certainly will, and we'll certainly keep the community posted on everything. So, but I do really appreciate everyone's support out there, and yeah, we'll continue on with that down the road.
With respect to taking on the awesome and I'm sure stressful job of being president at CGC, what skills did you already possess that greatly helped you? And what were things you needed to learn for this new position?
That's an excellent question. Well, I had the benefit of operating in the comic field before I joined CGC, while CGC existed. I had a chance to become accustomed to the grading standards and all these things associated with CGC before I joined the company. My background, I obviously collected comics when I was a kid. I worked at a comic book store during college, More Fun Comics with Bill Ponsetti. And then I picked up restoration in the late 90s by training with Bill Cyril, who's considered the father of restoration. And then when CGC opened in 2000, it gave me a chance to expand the services that I offered besides restoration to include restoration removal and pressing. And so those were the main things that I was working on during the early 2000s leading up to me joining the company in 2013. So when I came into CGC, I pretty much reversed engineered the grading standards. I was the main person pressing books for people at the time, which is obviously that was one of the main reasons why they acquired my company, was to add the pressing services to the suite of services that CGC offered. And then obviously the restoration background gave me a lot of insight into restoration detection. And then also just all the people I had met, the dealers that I had established relationships with over the years was certainly helpful, all the collectors that I had met. And then obviously I knew the people within CGC as well. So when I came into the company, I was armed with a lot of information, but there was still more to learn. I'd probably say on the business end and also on the grading end. The grading end, I came in as the president of CCS, the pressing company, but pretty quickly started to transition over into the grading room, which was another intention of me getting hired. And so I started I was seeing behind the curtain. I was sitting in the room with the graders and grading books. And what I realized pretty quickly was, as much as I knew, as much as I learned, there was still, a good 5 or 10% that I hadn't learned yet. And that was from talking about it with the other graders, senior graders particularly, and also seeing all the books coming through, because I think one of the benefits of being a grader at CGC is that you see just thousands and thousands and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of books over the years that most people don't get a chance to see. And this could be anything from the newest books all the way back to Action 1. So just that exposure is really the fundamental thing to actually becoming a great grader, and then understanding all the nuances of CGC grading. So that was kind of started that stage of closing that gap, that last 5 or 10%. That they needed to truly become, I guess what I consider to be a world-class grader is what we call ourselves. Today, 10 years later, I'm very proud to say that, me and the group of people in the grading room, our collective knowledge and experiences, it makes us, it's unparalleled in the world, in terms of comic. So I'm very proud to have been a part of that. But and then in the business end of things, just seeing a larger company, how they operate, And this is probably true for anybody that joins a larger company, and certainly, because I was only operating with a few people in my office, so I got to see the inner workings of a company that was a few hundred employees big, and seeing how management worked and how just all the different aspects that go into dealing with a large number of people, and a product and a service that's being offered to thousands of people as well. So, and then of course Blackstone, acquiring the company 2.5 years ago, just ratcheted that up even higher. So, even the past 2 years, the things I've learned are a lot of new things that are certainly more high level now on global companies that other companies. So, I'm in the stratosphere compared to where I was 10 or 11 years ago.
Going back to learning about grading for comic books, so you're saying there might be 5 to 10% that you didn't know. Can you give me an example, one thing that you didn't know when you're coming from CCS and you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting?
Probably like how they treat outlier defects, printing defects, which I didn't come across very often. Strange, things on books. Trying to think like things, repairs, staple, missing parts, how they're classified. Because I didn't really deal much in that outside of CGC. The grading in the very high end, the 9.9s, the 10.0s, or even like the delineation between 0.5s and 1s. So there was, they're just like little things. I think a lot of people tend to focus on one area in collecting or dealing or pressing or restoring or whatever. They tend to focus on one kind of, certain kinds of books, certain kinds of grade ranges, certain things that they master. But at CGC, you kind of have to be the master of all of it because you're seeing all of it. And so that was same thing for me. I was first focused on low grade books restoring in the 90s, and that shifted to pressing high grade books. But that still left a lot of area that I need to learn moderns. For instance, I wasn't pressing a whole lot of ultra modern books with classics incorporated in the early 2000s. I think it's just a matter of having to learn it all. You can't know some of it. You got to know all of it.
We were talking before we start recording that I'm reading through the grading manual that you wrote, and I'll give you an example, something I never thought about. It's like, okay, imagine that you have a comic book that's got to insert a 3D glasses, and let's imagine that 3D glasses are still there, but they're detached. Like, how the hell do you treat that for a grade? I mean, it's such a minute piece, and you all actually have a grading rule for that.
Yeah, and we sat down for a couple of years before the book was published. Me and a group of the senior graders sat down for an hour or two, a couple of times a week for months, and I had printed out all 109 or however many defects it was, and we literally went defect by defect to create the parameters. Some were quantifiable, like creases or tears, but then some weren't, like foxing and staining. And then, of course, you came across ones like you're talking about, like glasses. What if they're detached, or what if they're torn in half, or what? There's like all these different variables you have to figure. And there were moments in there in the meetings where we were like, we've never encountered this before. So how would we grade this? And so we actually have standards established for a handful of things that we've never even seen before.
A lot of the people who are watching this video have a lot of experience in grading. But Matt, you brought up this term of being a world-class grader. So I'd like to hear from you, what's the difference between somebody who's like a really solid grader versus somebody who has evolved into or has been trained into being a world-class grader?
Part of it is what I mentioned earlier about being able to look at any book in any grade, 0.5 to 10.0, and accurately assess the grade on the spot. It doesn't matter what era the comic book's from. A solid grader is somebody who's been doing it for a while. They've submitted a lot of books to CGC, or they bought a lot of CGC graded material, and they've looked at them through the holders, and they can ascertain a grade. They can go, okay, that's a 6.0, that's an 8.0, that's an 8.5, and maybe even tell the differences between those grades. A world-class grader is someone who is able to not only be able to ascertain a grade every time that's they're landing in between two grades sometimes, or sometimes they land right on a grade, but it's the same one or two grades that are being assigned by the other handful of people that are sitting around you in the grading room. And so it's like this thing that you can't really put your hand on, put your fingers around, which is, it still blows my mind today, where I'm sitting around 5 other guys, and we're passing a book around, and we're all at the same grade, or a couple of us are like one grade off. And it's just amazing to me that, given the infinite variables involved with defects on books, particularly lower grade books, that we can still accurately assess a grade amongst ourselves, or cumulatively agree on a grade. So it goes to show that there is something there. There's something out there that we have learned, a standard that actually exists in the ether. And as we've looked at, thousands of books, hundreds of AF-15s, dozens of Action 1s, and thousands of Hulk 181s, you've got that mental picture in your head. Every one you look at, you're just comparing to all the other copies you've seen and in that grade or in the grades around it. And you're looking at subtle things like the ink strike, or aging defects, or printing defects on the book, and you're able to accurately assess every single little thing on that book to come up with an accurate grade over and over and over again. And then, of course, spotting restoration and all the other nuances that go into grading. So it's basically making as few mistakes as possible, almost zero, for every book that you grade every single day. and that's probably the difference.
In your experience, what are the types of books that cause professional graders fits? So you were just saying, hey, there's a book, we've got 5 graders. You got 3 people at a 6.0 and 2 at a 6.5. That's great. You know it's right in there. But what are the times when you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if this is a 3 or a 7?
Yeah. There's, the first thing that comes to mind are restored books, or restored books with married parts. We actually just graded some today. They're typically older restoration jobs from the 80s, let's say, maybe the 90s. They're books that are worth restoring, like early, single-digit detectives, Detective 1 or something. They were just a wreck before. They had brittle pages, they were missing pages, they had huge chunks out of the cover. And so, you open it up and it's like every page looks different. They're all kind of, they're not lined up at all. The book has got tons of restoration on it in the cover. And so, we have to sit there and determine which pages were married. How much restoration was done in the book, what kind of restoration, how much is real versus how much is recreated, and to determine the extent of restoration. And so those cause us a lot of fits, because it slows us way down. It's not just, this is a 8085. It's like, no, we got to stop and go through like multiple steps. And another one is actually individual pages. This is something that's really blown up the past few years, where we started grading individual pages. And 20 years ago, people would have thought that collectors are mad to do that, but obviously with prices going up, people are now slabbing AF-15 pages and even Hulk 181 pages. And sometimes we get in the most random pages from random books, Flash, 158 or some, Bronze Age comic book that, you're kind of like, why are they getting this slab? But we have to confirm that page. And so we have to, sometimes it involves sleuthing. If we don't have another copy handy, then we have some resources online that we have to check to figure out what page it is. And we've been successful so far. There's been a couple of times. I think the worst invoice we ever got was strip reprint Golden Age pages from the mid to late 30s. And the problem is I don't know how familiar you are with these interiors, but it's not like a detective from 1940 where you've got 5 or 6 stories with the title of the story, and there's certain telltale signs you can tell. These are like Tilly the Toiler or Cats and Jammer Kids or whatever, and it's like 2 pages, 2-page story, 2-page story, 2-page story, 2-page story, and there's like literally 30 stories, and there's like 3 Blondie stories. There's one here, here, and here, and they're not numbered, and so you get these pages in, and we don't have a feature 36 laying around, or a tip top or whatever, and so we're like, we can't even begin to try and figure out, what these are. So I think there was one invoice we get a bunch like that, and I think we just sent it back. I'm just like, we can't reasonably assess exactly what pages these are, so it wouldn't be fair to encapsulate these. So, but that probably that one certainly gave us some headaches.
Yeah, so you heard it here, folks. Go back to the 1930s and 40s books you have. Just clip out a random page and send it to CGC and see what happens.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, slap some restoration on too while you're at it.
So something also new coming out of CGC are the graded pulps. By the way, I'm going to ask kind of a devil's advocate question. Okay. So some folks might be thinking, big deal. Now you're certifying pulps. It just takes a little bit bigger slab and you got it. Like, why is it hard to include something like pulps in your certification?
Some people were like, well, why wasn't CGC doing this 20 years ago? And then other people were like, CGC is crazy for doing this. And the truth is somewhere in between. When I got into it, when I started, exploring the possibility of certifying them, immediately the first challenge was the holder, and protecting the pulps, because the big issue with pulps, for those that don't know, is the overhang on the cover. The covers, unlike comics, which were trimmed, that last step where the comics were trimmed evenly on all three sides, pulps were not. It was a cost-saving step. And so the covers were printed separate from the interiors. They glued them all like square bounds, and that was it. The covers were trimmed here, the interiors were trimmed here, and then glued together. And so you ended up having covers on a lot of them that hang over the edge on, one, two, or all three sides. Usually two, and sometimes they hang over a lot. And so not only was this a grading challenge because it introduced a different aspect to the grading, because we don't grade extra paper on comics very often at all, if ever. Sometimes we do it with a slight overhang, but this is something that is very significant in pulps. But also, how do you protect that in the holder? And so that was the big challenge, was before we even started grading, was, well, what's the holder going to look like? How's it going to protect these things? And so, the solution in the end was pretty elegant and simple. But surprisingly, it took, the better part of a year to conceptually get to that place. Mm-hmm. We explored so many crazy ideas that involved, like, a belt or something holding the book in place inside the holder to keep it from moving. Because the problem is that when the book shifts, if it shifts in the holder, let's say, because traditionally a comic book well is going to have walls, and so the book, it could bump into those walls, but you can't really have that with a pulp, because if the overhang is going to bump in the wall, it can get damaged. And so the idea is pretty simple. It's basically, we just take two lids that are equal or the same. They're identical, and we put them together, but the edges are angled like this on all four sides. And so the pulp, and the other key is that the pulp is kind of not squeezed in there tightly, but it's firmly in there. It's not top to bottom. I mean. So by the pulp being snug inside the well, and then having those angled sides all around, the pulp really has nowhere to go. Because it's hitting, the pulp is hitting that angled side. Meanwhile, the cavity that's created by the angled part of the well is where the overhang sits. And so the overhang it's got a place to be, and it's not being pushed into the wall because of that angle is preventing the pulp from sliding over. And so that was it. And once we had that, really everything else fell into place, because the grading is pretty much the same standards as comic books. There's a few subtle differences, and we'll have this in the announcement when you watch Pulps. But it's the factoring in the overhang obviously is a big thing, but spine fading, which you don't really see. Spines are not a big, the size of the spine is not as prevalent on comic book because they're not as thick. But on pulps, often you have spine fading because people put them on their bookshelves, and particularly the red spines, like the weird tails, would get faded over time. So you could have a beautiful pulp with a completely washed out yellow spine that should be red. We downgrade for that. And then restoration would be your typical. Again, it's kind of the same thing. It's glue repairs, particularly on the spine, the splits, tape, a little bit of color touch, and a lot of trimming. They love that, because of the overhang. They hated that overhang, so they trim it off. And so we're still identifying trimming. We're notating trimming on the label exactly as we do for comics, but instead of giving it a restored purple label, we're downgrading for it, giving a universal grade, and then downgrading if the grade, depending on the grade of the pulp and the extent of the trimming. So we have like a chart. Basically, the higher the grade, the more effect trimming you have.
I've got a couple other questions, and I want to get to you more as a hobbyist. So, take off your CGC President hat for a minute and just think about, Matt as the comic book enthusiast. And so a question for you, what's something that you personally discovered about comic books, something that deepened the knowledge base of the hobby?
I did, yeah. There was one big thing. I'm so proud of this. It was.
Stay tuned to learn about this amazing discovery in the next episode, which I'll post here. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. And for everybody, I will see you around real soon.